1 month. That's how long Wing Commander Peter Wykeham-Barnes spent in Korea. 1 month flying night missions over some of the most contested airspace on the peninsula in a borrowed American bomber, with American crews who had never done this before, against a supply network that only moved after dark and doing it in conditions that exposed every weakness in a doctrine the United States Air Force hadn't examined since the last war ended. 1 month. And in that month, a man with 14 confirmed aerial kills, 2 distinguished service orders, a distinguished flying cross and bar, and a decade of combat experience burning through his logbook, watched the most powerful Air Force on Earth make the same mistakes that had cost airmen their lives 5 years earlier. Mistakes the RAF had already paid in blood to understand. Mistakes that someone had failed to pass on. When he walked into the operations rooms of the 5th United States Air Force in the summer of 1950, he didn't arrive with arrogance. He arrived with facts. And the facts were brutal. The Americans were flying night interdiction missions over North Korea the same way they had flown daylight missions over Germany in 1944. Big formations, predictable routes, no low-level approach doctrine, no refined procedure for finding vehicles in the dark, no systematic method for exploiting the one advantage a night intruder pilot actually owns: invisibility. He told them what he saw. He told them what needed to change. Some of them listened. Some of them didn't. And then October 23, 1951 arrived, and the price of not listening was measured in burning superfortresses falling out of the sky over a place the Americans would forever call Black Tuesday. The story of what the British knew, how they came to know it, and what the United States Air Force did and didn't do with that knowledge is one of the most consequential and least told stories of the Korean Air War. It is a story about institutional memory, about what happens when a force mistakes hardware for doctrine, and about the particular kind of courage it takes to stand in front of men who believe they are already the best in the world and tell them they are wrong. To understand what Wykeham-Barnes brought with him to Korea, you have to understand what the RAF had learned flying at night over occupied Europe, because the lessons embedded in his career were not theoretical. They had been earned through years of operations against one of the most effective air defense networks ever assembled. Peter Guy Wykeham-Barnes joined the Royal Air Force as an apprentice in 1932. By the time he reached Korea, he had flown fighters over the western desert of North Africa, commanded squadrons through the Italian campaign, led No. 140, wing of the 2nd Tactical Air Force equipped with de Havilland Mosquitoes, and accumulated a combat record that placed him among the most experienced combat aviators in the British military. His 14 confirmed victories were not the product of lucky encounters. They were the product of a man who had spent years thinking about the problem of how to find, fix, and destroy an adversary who did not want to be found. The de Havilland Mosquito was the platform through which the RAF had developed its most sophisticated night interdiction doctrine. What made the Mosquito remarkable was not simply its speed, though at cruise it could outrun most of what the Luftwaffe sent after it. What made it remarkable was the philosophy it embodied. It was a twin-engine aircraft with no defensive armament in most variants. It survived not by absorbing punishment, but by not being there when the enemy tried to deliver it. Speed, altitude, and the darkness were its protection. Flying Mosquitoes on night intruder operations over France and Germany, RAF squadrons had developed a refined system of low-level attack against transportation targets. Specific tactics for entering and departing defended areas without triggering early warning systems, methods for identifying moving vehicles by their blackout compliance failures and heat signatures, and a training pipeline that produced crews who understood the night as an operational environment rather than simply an absence of light. The key insight was about psychology as much as physics. An aircraft approaching a target at high altitude on a predictable route at a published time is an aircraft the enemy can plan against. Ground observers see it from 10 miles away. Radar operators track it from further still. anti-aircraft crews walk their fire ahead of it based on speed and heading. The aircraft becomes a predictable event, and predictable events are what trained defenders live to counter. An aircraft approaching at low altitude on an unpredictable route, using the terrain for masking, arriving at an unknown time, is a different problem entirely. It appears from nowhere. It is gone before a defense can be organized. The entire equation of ground-based defense shifts against it because defense requires anticipation, and anticipation requires predictability. The RAF had learned all of this the hard way. The early years of night bombing operations over Germany had been catastrophic. Crews flying heavy bombers like the Sterling and the early Lancasters on high-altitude, poorly routed night missions had suffered losses that in some periods approached 15% per sortie. A loss rate of 15% meant that the average crew lasted fewer than 7 missions before they were killed or captured. The RAF responded not by abandoning night operations, but by systematically improving them. Better navigation aids, better coordination between pathfinders and main force, and crucially, better doctrine for suppressing the defenses that were killing the bombers. The Mosquito intruder missions had been a key part of that suppression. Crews flying at treetop height on diversionary routes, appearing over Luftwaffe night fighter airfields at unpredictable intervals, forced the German defenders into a posture of constant readiness that drained them far faster than direct combat could have. The pilot waiting in a cockpit at a German airfield, unable to take off because a Mosquito might be orbiting above the runway, was a pilot who wasn't flying missions against the bomber stream. The airfield commander who had to keep his lights off because the sound of Merlin engines somewhere in the darkness meant a Mosquito might be waiting for the next aircraft to land, was an airfield commander whose operational effectiveness was degraded every single night. This was what Wykeham-Barnes understood in his bones when he arrived in Korea in the summer of 1950. The lesson wasn't simply technical. It wasn't just about which altitude to fly or what approach angle to use. It was about how to think about the night as a weapon, about how a small force with limited resources could impose a cost on an enemy far out of proportion to its size by operating in a way the enemy could not predict or defend against. The United States Air Force in 1950 was the youngest service branch in the American military, having been formally separated from the Army only 3 years earlier. It was also, by any material measure, the most powerful Air Force on Earth. It possessed the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that had ended the Pacific War by demonstrating that strategic bombing from high altitude could reduce an industrial nation to the point of surrender. It possessed the newly developed North American F-86 Sabre, a swept-wing jet fighter that was among the most capable day-air superiority aircraft of its era. It possessed a logistics and support infrastructure that dwarfed anything any other nation could field. A global network of bases, trained maintainers, fuel distribution chains, and command and control systems that had been built at enormous expense during the Second World War and were now the backbone of American global power. What it did not possess in the summer of 1950 was a refined doctrine for night interdiction operations in a jet-age, limited war environment. The USAF's intellectual framework for the application of air power had been shaped almost entirely by the experience of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany and Japan. The big lesson of that campaign, as understood by the men who had risen to senior positions in the new service, was that air power employed at scale against an industrial enemy's production and logistics infrastructure could be decisive. Destroy the factories, destroy the rail networks, destroy the fuel refineries, and the enemy's ability to sustain modern warfare would collapse. Korea posed a different kind of problem. North Korea had no industrial base worth targeting in the conventional sense. What it had was a supply network stretching from the Chinese border southward to the front lines, a network of roads and railways and supply depots that kept Chinese and North Korean ground forces armed, fed, and fueled. The strategic imperative was interdiction. Cut those supply lines, starve the front lines of material, and force a resolution through attrition on the ground. The problem was that the North Korean and Chinese logisticians had learned from the Japanese experience in the Pacific and from decades of fighting under conditions of air attack. They moved at night. They dispersed their convoys. They used ox carts and human porters for the last miles before the front, loads small enough that even a direct hit was a nuisance rather than a catastrophe. They repaired roads faster than bombs could destroy them. And they did all of this in a landscape of mountains and valleys and narrow river crossings that made large-scale aerial interdiction enormously difficult. The B-29 was designed for daylight precision bombing from 25,000 feet against fixed industrial targets. It was not designed for night interdiction of dispersed supply convoys moving through mountain terrain. When the Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950, the USAF's only dedicated night attack aircraft were B-26 Invaders, a capable twin-engine light bomber, but ones operated by crews who had not developed the specific tactics, training, and target acquisition procedures that night interdiction required. The first B-26 night missions over North Korea in the summer of 1950 were effective in the broad sense of keeping pressure on the enemy. They were not effective in the precise sense of actually finding and destroying trucks on mountain roads in the dark. This is the gap that Wykeham-Barnes was sent to fill. The formal request came from the USAF 5th Air Force to the Air Ministry in London. Could the RAF provide an officer experienced in night intruder operations who could advise on technique and doctrine? The British supplied Wykeham-Barnes, who was at the time serving as a test pilot at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down, where he had been helping develop swept-wing aircraft that would eventually become the Hawker Hunter. He arrived in Korea in the late summer of 1950 and immediately began flying operational missions in B-26 Intruders alongside American crews. He was not there to observe from a distance. He was there to fly, to do the job himself, to understand the specific conditions of Korea firsthand, rather than advising from a position of abstract expertise. This was characteristic of how the RAF trained and developed its senior pilots. Knowledge that came from books and briefings was useful. Knowledge that came from flying the mission yourself, at night, at low altitude, over contested territory, was something different entirely. What he found when he began flying confirmed what he suspected from the pre-deployment briefings. The American crews were skilled aviators. They were brave. They were well equipped by the material standards of the era. But they were approaching night interdiction the way they had been trained to approach daylight bombing, with formations, with altitude, with predictable routing and timing. They were making themselves easy to track, easy to anticipate, and comparatively easy to defend against, not because they lacked skill, but because the doctrine they were executing had been developed for a different kind of war. The specific technical challenge was target acquisition. Finding a convoy of trucks on a mountain road in complete darkness requires either sensors that can detect them passively or a technique for encouraging them to reveal themselves. The RAF had developed both. Passive detection methods included listening for engine noise and watching for the faint glow of poorly shielded exhaust stacks. Active methods included the technique of flying over a target area and then going quiet in the darkness, watching for vehicle lights that resumed as soon as drivers thought the aircraft had departed. The classic RAF intruder tactic of lingering near a target without announcing your presence, waiting for the moment the enemy assumed you were gone, then attacking when the lights came back on, was a product of years of refinement over France and Germany. The other critical element was low-altitude approach. The mountains and valleys of Korea presented terrain that was in some respects more forgiving of low-level operations than the flak-dense environment of occupied Europe. A B-26, flying down a valley at 500 feet, throttled back, navigating by the faint gray shapes of ridge lines against a dark sky, was an aircraft that gave almost no warning to observers on the ground until it was directly overhead. Wykeham-Barnes had been doing variations of this since 1942. The American crews could do it too, but they needed the doctrine, the confidence, and above all the training framework that told them what to do and how to think about it. He established the feasibility of the B-26 for the night intruder role, something American planners had not been fully certain about, and began flying missions that demonstrated the approach in practice. His methods were observed, recorded, and in some parts of the 5th Air Force adopted. For this work, he received the United States Air Medal from Lieutenant General George Stratmeyer, the commanding general of Far East Air Forces, in Tokyo on September 10, 1950. And then he returned to the United Kingdom. The second British officer to arrive in Korea in the closing months of 1950 represented a different kind of expertise and carried a different kind of institutional weight. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson was the highest-scoring RAF fighter ace of the entire Second World War. His confirmed victories stood at 34, with 7 shared, and he had spent the war not simply accumulating kills, but systematically thinking about fighter tactics, about how formations should work, how pilots should be trained, and how the lessons of one engagement should be captured and disseminated so that the next generation of pilots could benefit from them rather than having to learn the same things at the same cost. Johnson arrived in Korea during an exchange posting to the USAF and flew both F-80 Shooting Stars and subsequently F-86 Sabres with American units. The contrast he encountered was stark. The USAF had trained its pilots in a tactical framework drawn from the late years of the Second World War, one that emphasized individual marksmanship, aggressive maneuvering, and the leveraging of superior aircraft performance. These were sound principles. They were not wrong, but they had been developed in a specific context against a specific adversary. And the Korean Air War was already beginning to reveal that context-specific tactics applied in a different context could be dangerously inadequate. The MiG-15 had appeared over North Korea in November 1950, and its appearance was a shock the American air community had not been prepared for. Not because the existence of Soviet jet fighters was unknown, but because the specific performance characteristics of the MiG-15 violated several of the assumptions built into American tactical doctrine. The MiG-15 could climb faster than the early model F-86. It had a higher operational ceiling, capable of reaching altitudes above 50,000 feet, roughly 5,000 feet, beyond what the F-86 could manage. Its armament, one 37mm cannon and 2 23mm cannons, delivered a weight of fire at any given instant that the F-86's 650 caliber machine guns could not match at medium and long range. And crucially, the MiG-15 could disengage vertically in a way the F-86 could not follow, climbing back into the safety of altitude whenever the engagement was going against it. The tactics the USAF had been using were not well suited to this threat. American pilots had been trained to seek decisive engagement, to close to gun range, and to destroy their targets. Against MiG-15s flown by experienced Soviet aviators who understood exactly how to use their aircraft's vertical performance to control the terms of engagement, decisive engagement could only happen on terms the Soviets chose. If the Soviets were winning, they stayed. If they were not, they climbed. American pilots accustomed to staying in a fight until it was resolved found themselves executing attacks that the enemy simply flew away from, vertically, at a rate of climb they could not follow. Johnson, watching this from the cockpit of an F-86, recognized patterns he had seen before. The German Focke-Wulf 190 in its early form had presented a similar challenge to Spitfire pilots in 1941. An aircraft with performance characteristics that allowed the enemy to choose when to engage and when to disengage. The solution the RAF had developed was not simply to fly harder or shoot better. It was to think differently about formation, about positioning, about the geometry of an engagement before the first shot was fired. The RAF's response to the Focke-Wulf had involved adapting the Finger 4 formation, the swarm that the Germans had developed in Spain and the RAF had copied early in the war, in ways that gave every pilot in the formation both a scanning role and a coverage responsibility. It involved developing a culture of mutual support so complete that the discipline of watching your wingman's tail became more important than the glory of making your own kill. And it involved, crucially, a willingness to break off an unfavorable engagement and reset, to accept that surviving to fight another day was not cowardice, but operational sense. These were lessons that resonated in Korea. The American pilot culture of 1950 had been shaped by a generation of airmen who had turned the aggressive, individualistic energy of the American national character into a military virtue. The lone wolf ace, the man who waded into an enemy formation and came out the other side with 3 kills and a good story, was the figure these men had been raised to admire. Johnson and others who had worked through the implications of that mythology in actual combat understood its dangers. The ace who survived was usually the man who had learned, often through painful experience, when not to be aggressive. The men who died were frequently the ones who confused boldness with tactical sense. In the shadow of all this, the Korean Air War underwent the crisis that validated every concern either British officer had raised. April 12, 1951, became known as Black Thursday. A formation of 48 B-29 superfortresses escorted by 18 F-86 Sabres, 54 F-84 Thunderjets, and 24 F-80 Shooting Stars was intercepted by 44 MiG-15 over the Yalu River. The Soviet fighters, led by formations from the 324th Air Division under one of the most experienced aviators in the world, tore through the escort and attacked the bombers directly. The Americans lost multiple B-29s, shot down or damaged beyond repair, along with escort fighters. The scale of the loss forced an immediate halt to daylight precision bombing operations in northwestern Korea. And then, almost exactly 6 months later, on October 23, 1951, came Black Tuesday. A formation of 9 B-29s targeted Namsi Airfield, barely 30 miles from the Antung complex, where over 100 communist MiG-15s were based. Soviet pilots flying in coordinated attacks against the lumbering superfortresses struck with a precision and ferocity that the escorting fighters could not prevent. 8 of the 9 B-29s were shot down or damaged beyond repair. The losses were catastrophic. From that day forward, the USAF essentially ended the concept of daylight precision strategic bombing in the Korean theater. The B-29 operations that had been central to American air power strategy since 1944 shifted to radar-directed night raids, which were less accurate but survivable, because the daylight missions were no longer survivable at all. The irony was complete and devastating. The B-29, the aircraft that had ended one war and defined American strategic air thinking, had been made effectively obsolete by a Soviet jet fighter in a conflict most Americans had not fully expected to fight. The assumptions that had shaped USAF doctrine, that the bomber would always get through, that fighter escort could protect a formation against jet interceptors, that the altitude and speed advantage of the B-29 would translate from propeller-era combat to the jet age, had been tested and found wanting. The night interdiction mission that Wykeham-Barnes had worked to establish during his 1950 visit became not an optional supplement to American air power strategy in Korea, but its primary means of striking at enemy supply lines. The B-26 invader units operating at night using the techniques he had helped to introduce eventually flew approximately 60,000 sorties over the course of the war, with the crews claiming the destruction of 38,500 vehicles, 3,700 railway cars, and 406 locomotives. The night belonged to the intruders, as he had said it could from the beginning, because the night was the environment that removed the MiG-15's advantages at a stroke. A swept-wing jet interceptor designed to catch bombers at altitude was not a useful weapon against a B-26, flying at 500 feet through a Korean valley in the dark. The tactical evolution in the fighter war also bore the marks of what Johnson and others had demonstrated. By 1952, the USAF had modified its approach in MiG Alley significantly. Formation discipline became stricter. The paired concept, shooter and wingman, became more systematically enforced. Pilots were encouraged and trained to disengage from unfavorable positions rather than pressing attacks that the enemy controlled. The recognition that pilot quality and tactical discipline were more decisive than raw performance began to permeate the culture in ways it had not in 1950. The USAF's true kill ratio against MiGs improved measurably over the course of the war, not because the F-86 became a better aircraft, but because the doctrine for employing it became better informed. There is a dimension to this story that numbers and tactical analyses cannot fully capture, and it lives in the specific nature of what institutional knowledge actually is and where it comes from. The RAF that Wykeham-Barnes and Johnson represented in Korea was not simply a collection of experienced pilots. It was an institution that had been forced to learn, at catastrophic cost, a comprehensive set of lessons about the application of air power in every environment and role that modern war could produce. The learning had not been painless or efficient. In the early years of the Second World War, the RAF had made its own horrifying errors. The Fairey battle light bombers sent against German columns in France in May 1940 had been massacred in daylight attacks that ignored the realities of modern air defense. The early years of the strategic bombing campaign had consumed thousands of airmen in operations whose tactical execution was badly flawed. The RAF had learned by dying, but it had learned. And crucially, it had developed systems for capturing and transmitting what had been learned in ways that subsequent generations of aircrew could access. The Central Fighter Establishment, at which Johnny Johnson served as officer commanding tactics before his Korean deployment, was precisely this kind of institution, a dedicated organization whose function was to study combat experience, extract transferable lessons, and codify them into doctrine and training that could be distributed across the service. By 1950, the RAF had been doing this continuously for over a decade across every operational environment the war had produced. The USAF in 1950 was an organization that had also learned enormously during the Second World War. The American military's capacity for institutional learning in the industrial sense, for processing experience at scale and turning it into training programs and equipment specifications, was extraordinary. The problem was not that the Americans couldn't learn. The problem was the gap. 3 years had passed since the end of the war, and in those 3 years, the specific tactical knowledge embedded in combat-experienced aircrew had begun to disperse. The men who had developed the techniques of strategic bombing, of escort fighter tactics, of night interdiction over the Reich had moved on to peacetime careers. Some had retired, some had moved into administrative roles. The institutional memory that had cost so much to build was aging and thinning, and the USAF that went to Korea in June 1950 was not the USAF that had fought over Germany in 1944. Wykeham-Barnes, arriving in Korea with a logbook that included mosquito intruder operations over occupied Europe, was carrying knowledge that the USAF effectively no longer possessed in operational form. He was not more skilled or more courageous than the American crews he flew with. He had simply been part of an institution that had never stopped doing the specific thing he was being asked to advise on, and as a result, he carried in his operational memory a depth of specific procedural knowledge that could not have been reconstructed from manuals or briefings. It came from doing, It came from thousands of night hours, from the specific sensory experience of flying at low altitude over contested terrain in the dark, from the accumulated body of small decisions and adjustments that experience deposits into a pilot the way sediment builds a riverbed. Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer understood what he was receiving when he pinned the Air Medal on Wykeham-Barnes' uniform in Tokyo. The USAF had asked for this expertise specifically because their own senior staff had recognized that something was missing, something that the most technologically advanced Air Force in the world could not find in its own personnel pool. The fact of the request was itself an acknowledgement. There was a category of operational knowledge that the British possessed and the Americans at that moment did not. That is a remarkable thing for any military to concede about any ally, and it speaks to the intellectual honesty of the American commanders who made it. The ground war in Korea eventually stabilized along lines approximating the original boundary at the 38th parallel, and the armistice was signed in July 1953 after 3 years of brutal fighting. The air war that was fought above that ground campaign produced a set of lessons that would take the American military another decade to fully process, and in some cases, longer. The direct lessons about night interdiction were learned and applied in Korea itself. The B-26 units that developed systematic night attack doctrine over the 3 years of the war became, in some respects, the most tactically innovative part of the American air campaign. The hunter-killer team techniques they developed, where one aircraft found the target and baited the drivers into revealing their positions, and a second aircraft attacked at the moment of detection, were direct descendants of the RAF intruder philosophy that Wykeham-Barnes had demonstrated in the war's first months. The lessons about fighter tactics and the limits of technological dominance were slower to absorb. The USAF emerged from Korea with a public claim of a 10-to-1 kill ratio that became a central piece of institutional mythology. When Soviet archives were opened after the Cold War and the actual figures could be examined, the picture was far more complicated. Against Soviet veterans of the Second World War flying MiG-15s in 1951, the kill ratio was closer to 1.4 to 1, barely favoring the Sabre, exactly the kind of near parity that anyone who had watched the actual engagements in real time could have told you was closer to the truth. The 10-to-1 figure was largely the product of engagements against inexperienced Chinese and North Korean pilots, inflated by combat claims that wartime pressure consistently pushes toward optimism. The deeper lesson, that technological advantage at the platform level, does not translate automatically into tactical superiority. That doctrine and training are variables that determine outcomes as decisively as specifications, was precisely what the RAF officers had come to Korea to demonstrate. A MiG-15 flown by a Soviet veteran of Stalingrad, operating with a clear understanding of how to exploit his aircraft's vertical performance, was a match for an F-86 flown by a USAF pilot whose tactical framework had not kept pace with the realities of jet-age combat. The aircraft that won individual engagements were not always the aircraft whose specifications were superior. They were the aircraft whose pilots understood the fight better, who had been prepared by training and doctrine and institutional knowledge to make better decisions in the fractions of seconds that determined survival. The F-86 Sabre was in many respects genuinely superior to the MiG-15 in the low to medium altitude environment where most of the actual combat occurred. Its hydraulically boosted controls gave pilots better responsiveness in sustained turning fights. Its bubble canopy provided visibility that the MiG's frame design could not match, a genuine life-or-death advantage in a scissors maneuver where seeing the enemy first was everything. Its radar-ranging gun sight was more sophisticated than the MiG's equivalent, giving pilots better firing solutions at the closure speeds of jet combat. These were real advantages, and the best American pilots exploited them effectively. But those advantages were negated whenever MiG pilots operated on their own terms. Attacking from altitude, making single slashing passes against bomber formations and disengaging back into the height sanctuary before the escorting Sabres could organize a response. The B-29 losses on Black Thursday and Black Tuesday were not the product of inferior American aircraft. They were the product of inferior American doctrine in a specific situation for which that doctrine had not been prepared. And the specific situation, high-altitude daylight bomber operations against a target defended by jet interceptors that could outclimb the escort fighters, was precisely the situation that RAF combat experience had already identified as unacceptable. Wykeham-Barnes had not told the Americans their doctrine would get them killed because he disliked them or doubted their courage. He told them because he had seen similar errors kill British airmen earlier in a similar war, and because the gap between what he had learned and what he observed in Korea was too wide to ignore. The knowledge he carried was not theoretical. It was earned. And the only question in those first weeks of 1950 in the 5th Air Force's planning rooms was whether the people in those rooms were prepared to hear that something they believed they knew was in fact something they had forgotten. The specific operational legacy of the British contribution to the Korean Air War played out in the years that followed in ways that extended far beyond Korea itself. The concept of the Central Fighter Establishment, which the RAF had maintained as the institutional home of fighter tactics development throughout and after the Second World War, became a model for what the Americans eventually built in the form of the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Established in 1969 after the Vietnam air-to-air performance against North Vietnamese MiGs, proved that the lessons of Korea had, once again, been allowed to fade. The pattern was almost identical. American fighter pilots in Vietnam found themselves at a kill ratio of roughly 2.4 to 1 against North Vietnamese MiG-17S and MiG-21S, aircraft that were in most technical specifications inferior to the F-4 Phantoms and F-105S that opposed them. The reason was not the aircraft, it was the doctrine and training. The pilots of the 1960s, like the pilots of 1950, had been prepared for a war that technology was supposed to make simple. Beyond visual range missiles would make the dogfight obsolete. Close-in maneuvering combat would be a relic of the piston era. The F-4 did not even carry a gun in its original variants because guns in the era of the long-range missile were considered unnecessary. The North Vietnamese, flying ancient MiG-17 at speeds the F-4 could barely fly slowly enough to match, demonstrated conclusively that the dogfight was not obsolete. It was merely waiting for an enemy who was willing to force it on terms where the technological advantage did not apply. The gun was retrofitted onto the F-4. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, was established at Miramar to rebuild the tactical culture that had been allowed to deteriorate. The kill ratio recovered, and the intellectual framework for that recovery drew directly on the kinds of lessons that men like Wykeham-Barnes and Johnson had been trying to deliver to American commanders in Korea 20 years earlier. The pattern illuminates something fundamental about how military knowledge works and how military institutions fail. Knowledge that costs blood to acquire does not automatically persist. It must be maintained, refreshed, and transmitted to the next generation of practitioners through institutions specifically designed for that purpose. When those institutions are neglected, when the peacetime military decides that the specific operational lessons of the last war are less important than preparing for the theoretical next war, the knowledge erodes. And when the next war comes, the cost of relearning what had already been learned is paid again, in the same currency that purchased it the first time. Wykeham-Barnes returned from Korea in late 1950 and went on to a distinguished career, eventually rising to Air Marshal and becoming Deputy Chief of the Air Staff before his retirement in 1969. He had spent 37 years in an institution that took its operational knowledge seriously, that maintained the lessons of experience across time and through the institutional structures specifically designed to preserve and transmit them. What he brought to Korea in 1950 was the product of that system, not supernatural insight, not uniquely British courage. An institutional memory that had been maintained because the RAF understood at an organizational level that the lessons of one war are the only preparation available for the next. Johnson returned from Korea to continue a career that would take him to Air Vice Marshal rank and beyond, influencing British fighter development and doctrine into the 1960s. He had done in Korea what he had done throughout his career, observed, analyzed, adapted, and attempted to pass on what he had learned to the people who came after him. The Americans who fought alongside them in Korea were not slow learners or poor pilots. The units that adapted to the realities of jet combat over MiG Alley developed tactics and disciplines that did work, that did survive, and that did eventually drive a kill ratio that, against all but the most experienced Soviet flyers, decisively favored the Sabre. The problem was never about individual capability. It was about the time, the cost, and the lives consumed in the process of learning, under fire, what might have been learned before the first sortie was flown. The phrase, "you won't last a week here," may not have been spoken in exactly those words. The record is not clean enough to attribute a specific sentence to a specific moment in the operations rooms of the 5th Air Force in the summer of 1950. What the record does show is that experienced RAF officers were brought to Korea precisely because American commanders recognized that their own force lacked something critical, that the knowledge the British carried was not available from their own resources, and that without it, the missions they were being asked to fly would fail. What the record also shows is that on April 12, 1951, and again on October 23 of the same year, the price of not fully internalizing that knowledge was paid in full. B-29s burning over North Korea. Crews killed or captured. A strategic bombing doctrine declared operationally defunct in the face of jet-age interceptors that the doctrine had not been designed to defeat. The wing commander from the RAF who flew night missions over Korea in a borrowed B-26 in the summer of 1950 did not save those men. His visit was too short, his reach too limited, the institutional inertia of a massive air force too powerful to be deflected by one man's month of operational flying and hard-won advice. But he was right. The things he demonstrated were real. The lessons he carried were valid. And the years that followed, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in every subsequent examination of what air power doctrine should look like, vindicated every word. This is the story that the Korean Air War tells, underneath the statistics and the kill ratios and the aircraft specifications, that the knowledge of how to fight in the air does not come with the aircraft. It comes from the men who have fought before. And when you send those men home before the lesson is learned, the war teaches it again, on its own schedule, in its own time, at its own price. The British arrived in Korea with their experience and their hard doctrine and their carefully maintained institutional memory of how night operations worked and what happened to bombers that flew in formations against jet fighters. The USAF was the most powerful air force in the world. It had the budget, the aircraft, the organization, and the sheer industrial might to meet any enemy on any terms it chose. What it did not have in the summer of 1950 was the specific knowledge that was needed for the specific war it had just entered. And the men who had that knowledge had come from Boscombe Down, and from the Central Fighter Establishment at West Raynham, and from the collective memory of an Air Force that had been building and maintaining its operational doctrine since before the Spitfire was designed. They offered what they knew. The question was, who was listening? The story of the British contribution to the Korean Air Campaign remains one of the least documented chapters of that conflict. Wing Commander Peter Guy Wykeham-Barnes, KCB DSO, and Bar OBE DFC and Bar AFC died on February 23, 1995. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, Air Vice Marshal James Edgar Johnson, CB, CBE, DSO, and 2 bars, DFC and bar, died on January 30th, 2001. The men they flew with in Korea outlived the era in which their specific knowledge was fully understood. The lessons of MiG Alley eventually became the foundation of fighter tactics doctrine from Fort Liberty to Lossiemouth. The journey from "you won't last a week" to that understanding cost exactly what it had always cost.